When it comes to 3D graphics, modeling is only one aspect of digital art, games, or animated movies. Sure, you may be able to build the Sistine Chapel, but if you don't know how to paint, it loses everything that makes it interesting. Texture is how we make objects interesting. While topology makes up the volume of the object and how it bends and moves, texture gives us about everything else. Texture gives us color, and it gives us control over how lights interact with our object. Is our object reflective and mirror-like, or does it absorb light? Is our object coarse like sandpaper, or is it smooth like water? Is the surface metallic and shiny? Is it transparent or translucent in any way? And if so, how? Does it let light all the way through like glass, or does it stay opaque and scatter through like it would if you shined a flashlight through the webbings of your fingers? Are there any surface imperfections? Any cuts, scrapes, gouges, or dents? What about the presence of gravel, the bark on a tree, the weave of the fabric, or the wrinkles of the skin? Or what about light emissions? Some surfaces like television screens, monitors, and LEDs all produce light. What color and how strongly do they emit? All of those things combine together to make one material, and as amazingly complex and sophisticated as it can all seem and sound, all of these things can just be simply printed out on paper. They're simply pictures, they're image files. If you were so inclined, you could literally make a texture in MS Paint. In fact, hold on. Right, here you go. Here's a texture made exclusively in MS Paint. I never said it would be the best texture, but you can do it. I also got a little bit carried away. At the moment, I don't expect anyone to understand what's going on here. The short and simple of it is that I used that MS Brick texture as both the roughness and the bump map. The PS1 didn't support bump mapping or lighting like this anyway, I just added it for fun. But we will talk about shader nodes in another video. So I made a basic image texture in MS Paint and we did some voodoo magic and suddenly we have a material. I've also gone and applied it to other various objects so we can see how they look. Now, I realize that I've sped through this process. I have a bit of a bad habit of doing that. So let's slow it down a bit and go over materials and how to add them to objects because, you know, it's kind of important to know how to do that. I'll just delete these objects and start over. Whenever we make an object from the Add menu by hitting Shift+A, any object that we make will start off with a default white material. Now, say we want to take this cube and we want to give it some color. Let's say red. We have to give it a material to tell it to do this. So, let's add a material. So to add a material, we go over here to this tab, the one with the red sphere and a sort of checkerboard on it. And with our object selected, we can see over here, well, nothing at the moment. We can see the name of our object here, and this area right here would display all the materials an object would have if it had any. So let's add one by clicking the New button. We can now see that we have a new material in our menu, and we got a whole litany of sliders and values down here. Yeah, there's a lot of them. For our purposes, we don't need any of this right now. We only need the basics. So we're gonna change the type of shader. Our current shader is listed right here, right next to where it says surface. Our current shader is called the Principal BDSF, and it is used for making very detailed and very realistic renders. However, for our purposes, we only need the basics, so we're basically just gonna rip everything out. We need a shader that is as minimalistic as we can possibly get. So to do that, we need to change our current shader. We can change our shader by clicking on the Surfaces menu and changing our shader from Principal to Diffuse by finding it in the menu or by hitting D on our keyboard. Now looking at our materials, it's a lot easier to understand. So if we wanted to change the color, all we gotta do is click on the color value and pick a color, and it's as easy as that. Okay, well now let's say we wanted our image texture that we made and we wanted to apply it now. To add an image texture, we do the same thing as before when we went to change the RGB value in the base color section. Instead of clicking on the RGB value, we click on the circular button next to it. Then what we want to find is the option that says Image Texture, or alternatively when this menu comes up, you can simply hit the shortcut T and it'll automatically select the image texture. Now we can see that our base color section has changed slightly. Since I already have my texture image ready, all I need to do is apply it. So I'll click Open and find it in my directory. Now when we add our image texture, one thing you will notice is that our texture is slightly blurry. This is because of how small the resolution is and because of texture filtering. I think I've said this before about texture filtering. It's great for making textures look higher resolution than they actually are. In fact, that's one thing the Nintendo 64 used to its advantage. However, the PlayStation 1 doesn't actually support texture filtering, so we're gonna have to turn it off. To go about doing that, we gotta go down here beneath our image source where it says Linear. This is the texture interpolation menu. So open it, and what we wanna do is we wanna set our current setting to closest. Now we can see that our texture is nice and crisp. And that there is the basics of texturing. Well, we have our brick material that we just made, and it works great. And we got our character model, For giggles, why don't we just apply the brick material to it? I mean, I didn't expect it to look great, but that didn't work like it should have, so it happened. So why does it work for the cube and this monkey fella, but not our model? Well, when it comes to 3D graphics software, be it Maya or Blender, it's not always as easy as throwing an image texture on an object and calling it a day. Our software simply doesn't understand the surface of our models. We have to tell our software how to break down our 3D model into a 2D surface, and this is where we get into the subject of today's video, UV mapping. So what is UV mapping, you may ask? Well, UV mapping is our way of telling our software how to apply image textures onto our model. If the image textures are the paint, then the UV mapping is the canvas. Remember how all the default objects didn't have a problem with the textures that we made? We're now going to dive into the UV editing feature of Blender so we can take a look at our original cube we applied our material to and see what's up. So we select our cube and we go up here to where all of these tabs are, and we're going to click on the one that says UV Editor. And when we click it, our display is going to change, so let's take a minute to let our eyes adjust and understand what's different. On the left, we can see our image texture that I made. It's got some kind of cross shape splayed over the top of it. And over on the right, we can see the 3D viewport. Blender has gone and brought us into edit mode as well as changed our shading method. I'm going to go ahead and swap our shading mode back to the render preview it was set on. It's going to be more helpful. Alright, so what's going on here? Well, I'm sure you've figured it out by now. This over here is our UV map. This is the 2D representation of our cube. The way that our UV map is moved or oriented in this texture space determines how the texture will be applied to our model. For every basic object that we can make, Blender has a pre-generated UV map that we can use. This does make our lives a lot easier if we just need a basic ball or plain surface. We can just throw a material on it and go about our way. But now let's do this. I'm going to extrude the top up and scale it inwards a bit. And now the UV map is completely broken. We got that streaking that we were seeing earlier. And you may have noticed that while I was editing this, whatever face that I had selected appeared over here in the UV editor. When I click on the new faces that we made, we can see that they're being compressed down into a single line. That's where the streaking is coming from. These faces right here barely even represent 1 pixel's width of this texture. So when things get broken, we gotta fix them. We're gonna have to make our own UV map. First, we gotta do some housekeeping to make sure that we got this set up right. Over here in the UV editing space, if we hit N on our keyboard, we can open up the sidebar here. What we want to do is go over here into the View tab and go over to the Overlays menu. And here we're going to toggle an option called Stretching. This will turn our whole UV map blue. Now if we start stretching and twisting our UV map here, we'll start to notice that the UV map starts to change colors. The hotter the colors, the more distortion there will be when Blender applies the texture to our model. You can see those faces that are being compacted are a lot hotter than the other faces. We'll have to fix that. One of the goals at the end of this process is to end up with a UV map that has little to no distortion whatsoever. To actually start making our UV map, we're going to start over here in the 3D space. I'm just going to click an edge here. I'm going to hit Control E to bring up the edge menu. We're going to look for an option that says Mark Seams. Now you'll notice that the edge that we had selected has turned red. And you'll also notice that the UV map hasn't changed either. This is because at the moment we have to manually tell Blender to update the UV map whenever we mark a seam. We can select our whole mesh by hitting A, then hitting U to bring up the UV mapping menu. At the top of the menu, we'll see an option that says Unwrap, and when we hit that, now our UV map updates. And we can see that, well, the UV map has gotten worse. We'll talk about that in a second. We really don't want to have to manually update every time we make a seam. It's just going to make the process longer. So go back into the UV mapping menu, and right underneath Unwrap, we can toggle Live Unwrap. Now whenever we mark a seam in the mesh, the UV map will automatically update in real time. Okay, so what's happened over here on our UV map? Well, what has happened is that we have overwritten the original UV map, and this is what Blender has calculated to be the flattest possible representation of our model. The best way that I found to explain how this works goes like this. Imagine our object is like a cardboard box. Blender is trying to break it down by cutting along the seams where we placed them and folding them flat. When we cut our models like this, Blender will try to preserve the shape and surface area of our faces. However, when there are not enough seams, it'll crush it flat as best as it can. To complete the metaphor, what you're seeing is Blender stomping on our box. So let's add some more seams to make this cut better. There are many ways to go about skinning a cube, so let's just go for it. The way that I often think about UV mapping for things as basic as this is like how you would go about cutting up a can of Coke for DIY projects. First you cut off the top and the bottom, and then you cut up the side of the can. After all, if you think about it like this, a cube is just a cylinder with a lot less edges. You may have noticed while I was working over here in the 3D space selecting edges and marking seams, the UV map over here disappeared. and we can't see it anymore. We can only see portions of the UV map when we have faces selected, which obviously ain't helpful to us because we're currently working with edges. I'm going to turn on one more feature that's going to make this a much easier process. I'm going to go over here in the UV editing window, and I'm going to toggle this button right here. This button right here with the two parallel arrows is called the UV sync selection. Now, whenever we make selections at our mesh, we can see exactly what points correspond to the UV map and vice versa. And now that we can see our entire map while we work, let's step a little bit into my mind process of how I go about UV mapping. Now, I'm going to start placing seams. I'm going to take these top 3 edges here, and I'm going to mark them. I know that I want to mark these edges because mentally I'm thinking when I make these seams, this portion of this model will pop up and be flat. Now, to do the same thing with the bottom, which again, does the exact same thing, and now we can see that our map is starting to look pretty good. However, I can still see that in the corners there are some twinges of brighter blue. I'm going to go about fixing that, but I don't need the 3D viewport anymore. I'm just going to full screen into our UV editing viewport by hovering over it and hitting Control Space. I'm just going to go about marking these edges here just like I would have if I was in the 3D viewport. And with that, we have a great UV map, and the texture looks good on the model too. We still got a good bit of time left in the video. Why don't we take a moment to UV map all of our objects from our scene? It'll be good practice so you can get some insight behind my UV mapping process and how I work. I took the time to link all of our objects into our scene. The MRE packages, the cans, the breakfast machine. I already talked about how to add objects to our scene in a previous video, so I don't feel I need to go over it here. For this scene, I'm going to start off with the easy things first. We know every object in the scene is inevitably going to have its own material. Obviously our coffee isn't made out of table, so we need to have different materials for our different objects. But as we're starting out, we don't know how big we want our textures to be for each object, or whether or not they need to be textured at all. So just for unwrapping's sake, I'm going to just use one material for every object that we're unwrapping. Let's make that material now. So we're going to go to our materials tab and add a new material. And we're going to change our material from the principal BDSF to the diffuse like we've had previously. And for the color, we're going to set it to be an image texture. Now, theoretically, we can use any image as a texture that we want. However, Blender has the ability to generate different types of textures that we could use for our own purposes. So what we're going to do is we're going to click New, and this is going to bring up a new menu that we can interact with. This is the new image menu. By default, Blender uses 1024 by 1024 for all new images that it would generate. Obviously this is too high for our purposes, so let's just set it to 256 by 256. Another thing that we want to change is we want to change the generated type. By default, the generated type is set to blank, which means whatever the color data is set to is what the image will be generated as, a blank colored data. We're going to set the generated type to color grid, and well, I suppose you'll see what this does. So now when we go into UV edit mode, we can see that our image texture is a colored grid. And this generated texture is perfect for us, so that way we can see each individual pixel of our texture as it goes. Alright, so one last housekeeping thing. We want to be able to find this texture when we need it, so let's name it. Just double click on the name and we'll type in test material. So now let's unwrap our plate. If we take a look at what our plate looks like in the material preview, it looks like clown vomit, let's be real. So let's go about UV mapping now. Now really all that a plate is really just a top and a bottom. The sides are basically negligible, they don't really have much of anything to them. So I'm just gonna mark the top seam right here. And with that, the plate is perfectly fine now. There's a little bit of distortion on the sides here, you can see this teal outline around it. However, if we look at the plate in the 3D viewport, you can't really tell much of a difference. So to me, this is perfectly fine. Alright, let's step it up a notch. Let's do the mug now. I'm gonna hide everything else so nothing gets in the way while we're doing this. Going to assign our test material real quick. Now the first order of business is to break that handle off, because if that handle wasn't there, all this would be a perfect cylinder. So we'll just mark seams around the edges of the handle here, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to place seams along these edges right here. The reason being is when we marked this handle off with the seams, it really became a glorified tube, it's sort of curved. So by placing one set of seams along it, it turns into a pipe that has been cut down the middle. So when we check the UV map, it's already laid out and perfectly fine. Alright, now I want to hide the handle. I could just go about selecting every vertices manually, but that takes too long. What I'm going to do is I'm going to swap into face select mode, make sure I'm hovering over the area that I want to select, and hit L. And then what I'm going to do is going to go down here to this menu and select seam. So basically what this does is it selects every vertice that is connected except when it hits a certain boundary. In this case, we set the seams to be the boundary, so it'll expand all the way until it reaches these seams and stop. And then we can just hit H and hide them. Now for the rest of the mug. Really, it's nothing but a glorified cylinder, but instead of having a top, it has an inside. So we'll mark the inside face here and the bottom face. And with that, now we just need to cut along the side so that way it rolls outward. Now we'll notice in the UV space, this island here is actually bowed a little bit. This is caused by the shape of the faces on this cup right here. Take notice that they're more trapezoidal in shape. Basic geometry would tell us that the bottom face here is wider than the top face. And now that there is a ring of them, when it's trying to be forced flat, it's being pinched inward. So here's how we're gonna go about fixing it. There are two ways to go about fixing it. I'm gonna show the first way. The second way is gonna come up when we do the bowl. All right, so the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna mark all of these edges along the inside of the rim. To go about selecting these edges, the fastest way to do it would be to hold Shift, Control, Alt, and clicking the two set of rings. Hell of a shortcut, but it works. And with those edges selected, we're gonna mark them, and that should fix our UV map. Yep, sure enough. Now to go about doing the bowl. Pretty standard at this point. Mark the inside and the bottom faces here, then mark a seam up the top like this. Now a few seconds ago I said trapezoidal faces cause problems because of their general geometry. Well, our bowl is now basically made out of exclusively nothing but trapezoids. So no matter how many seams we place along the side of it, we're not going to alleviate any of the stretching that we have going on here. So this is one of those cases where we're not going to win the battle with stretching. We're going to have some stretching. Let's just try to alleviate as much stretching as possible by marking seams along the mesh to help it unfold better. I think these ring of faces are the flattest out of all of them, so I'm not going to mark them. Alright, now we're going to use a special feature of Blender, but first we're going to have to do a little bit of prep before we can use it. We need to find a face in this UV island that is as close to a perfect rectangle as possible. Straight up and down, not diagonally. It's not going to work diagonally. I think this face looks perfectly fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to aid it along to being a perfect rectangle. We're going to take the top and the bottom faces and we're going to scale them on the y-axis to 0. And then we're going to do the left and the right side the same way, except we're going to scale them on the X. Now, here's where the feature's going to come in. We're going to select this face in the UV space. We can see that in the 3D space, it's highlighted right here. We're going to hit A to select the rest of the mesh. What you'll notice is that the face that we had selected is brighter than the surrounding faces. Whatever face that we click on becomes what is known as the active element. Normally that doesn't really mean much. But here's where it does. What we're going to do is we're going to hit U to bring up the UV mapping menu, and we're going to find the option that says Follow Active Quad. And when we do that, that'll force our UV island to stretch itself to be parallel to our current active face. It was important that we made that face in the UV space rectangular. Otherwise, if we had used any other face, like this one, it would skew the island to the shape of the active face. Alright, now we got our island kind of the way we want it to be. We have the seams in place that would alleviate the stretching, however we can't force those areas to unwrap themselves. And if we try to force unwrapping by selecting those areas to unwrap them, it would only calculate UV maps for those areas in particular without any consideration for the other parts. So obviously that's not our answer, and we can't just select everything and hit unwrap because otherwise we just go back to where we started. So what we need to do is we need to be able to force Blender to hold certain points of our UV map in place while we unwrap the rest. We can do that by selecting portions of our map and hitting P on our keyboard. So first I'm going to select this row of faces and I'm going to hit P. And you will notice that the vertices of those faces in the UV mapping space are now red. This means that they're now pinned and will not move when we hit unwrap. Alright, and with that, let's select everything one last time and hit unwrap. I kind of forgot that when you pin islands in the UV edit mode, they're ignored in the calculations for unwrapping other UV islands. So when we hit unwrap, these islands just fill in the space. This is a little bit annoying, but I did do this intentionally. Now we can just as easily undo it, pin those faces, and then recalculate. However, I want to show you two more features that you can use in UV mapping. Now, geometrically speaking, when we did that, the faces for the top and bottom are now disproportionate to the other UV islands. We can fix this easily enough by selecting all of the UV islands, going up here to the UV drop-down menu, and finding the option that says Average Island Scale. So what this option does is it compares the UV islands that we've made to their 3D viewport counterpart, and this will determine their size. So after we select it, we notice that our islands are now bigger than the actual UV space itself. One thing we can do is select all of our UV islands and manually scale them down to fit within the space. However, there's obviously an easier way to do this. To make Blender do this for us, what we need to do is go back in the UV dropdown and find the option that says Pack Islands. And just like that, it optimizes our UV maps to fit perfectly within the bounds of the image space. And now we're done with the bowl. That was a bit of a fun one, wasn't it? Alright, what else is there? Oh, we never did the cardboard box. Let's do that one real quick. It's easy enough. So the cardboard box only really needs 4 seams along the inside to make it work. So I'm just gonna add those real quick and, I noticed that there were 2 things wrong with this UV map. One obvious and one a little bit more subtle. Let's address the subtle one first because that requires a little bit more nuance. Now you may not notice it, but this UV map doesn't technically match the topology of our current object. It's a little bit hard to notice, but if we look from above, I think you can tell the difference. Another giveaway is if you zoom in on the texture of the model, you'll notice that it's actually being squashed vertically. And as far as we know, we've done everything right. But here's the thing. We missed an error message because we're currently using Live Unwrap. If we manually go and hit the Unwrap button ourselves, we're gonna get a small notification down here. Object has non-uniform scale. Unwrap will operate on a non-scaled version of the mesh. So basically what this means is that at some point or another, when we were outside of edit mode, we either accidentally or intentionally scaled our object along a particular axis and not across all of them at once. We can check the scale of our object by checking out the sidebar in the Items tab, and looking at the scale of our cardboard box. Yep, that's definitely not uniform. However, our box is the precise size that I want it to be. If I set the scale to be uniform by making these numbers match, it's going to disrupt how I want my box to look. So what we need to do to go about fixing this is to make sure that our object is currently selected and then hitting Control A. What this is going to do is going to bring up a menu called the Apply menu. And what this does is it takes any of the changes that we've made in object mode and it applies them to the topology as if it were in edit mode. So if I were to hit Apply Location, our origin point would be moved to the world origin point because our mesh would have been shifted. It's complicated. So when we hit Apply Scale, what it does is it resets our current scale from what it is right now all the way back to 1 across all axes, which makes its current size the default size, and also makes the scale uniform. So now when we unwrap, we'll notice that the UV map looks more like what it should. And now for the obvious problem. It's currently rotated on an angle. I don't know why Blender does this, but sometimes it just orients our islands wrong. It has something to do with the way that we mark our seams. I don't know why, but it just does it sometimes. So one solution is to just try again with marking seams and see if it fixes itself, which is really annoying. Or we can do it like this. I'm just gonna rotate it as best as I can so it looks as straight as possible. And then what I'm gonna do is go up to the UV drop-down menu and I'm gonna toggle another feature called Constrain to Image Bounds. So now when I hit scale, our island is going to be forced to be compacted within the UV space that we have applied for it. I'm gonna scale it down a little bit less than the actual UV space itself, and then I'm gonna move it to the bottom left corner. Now, I'm gonna tell the 2D cursor to go to the bottom left corner too. I'm gonna go into the view menu and the sidebar, and I'm gonna set the cursor location to 0, 0. Then I'm gonna go up here to my pivot point menu, and I'm gonna set it to 2D cursor mode. And now with my cursor in the bottom left corner, I'm gonna select my island and I'm gonna scale it as best that I can to fit within the UV space. Now, this does seem like a lot of faffing to go about getting a perfect UV map, and you're right. But at the same time, considering that our textures are as small as they are, we need to utilize them as best as we can. Alright, the box is done. What else is there? Oh, we haven't even touched the table yet. How could we have forgot the table? Well, before we unwrap the table, we have to clear the table, so let's hide everything else, and let's get down to it. So, the first thing that I think we should unwrap are the legs. I mean, they're literally just cubes that I stretched upwards on the Z-axis, so these should probably be one of the most easiest things we've ever unwrapped. One thing I'm going to do with the legs is I'm going to focus on one of them, and then I'm going to copy all of my work onto the other ones, just to save me some work. By now, you should probably know how to unwrap a cube, so I'm not going to go into that one. But you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, if we look at this table leg, there's no way that this top face here is ever going to be seen. It's being hidden by the underside of the table. There's no reason to have faces that you're never going to see to begin with, so we should probably just delete it entirely. Alright, so I unwrapped the leg, and now I just need to copy my work. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm pretty certain I've shown this feature off before, but I'll show it off again. I'm gonna select all of our legs by hitting A, and then we're gonna go into the mesh menu and find an option called symmetrize. Now, the leg that we worked on was in the top right, and if you understand the Cartesian graph system, then you should know that the leg is currently in the first quadrant, where the X and Y are both positive. So in the symmetrize menu down here, we have to make sure that when we're symmetrizing, we have to go from the positive to the negative. So we'll be going positive X to negative X and positive Y to negative Y. Now when we're done symmetrizing our legs, you'll notice that in the UV map space, there's only one island now. We can see that the legs of our table are now sharing the exact same texture space. So no matter what, all of these legs will be sharing the exact same color data, which in this case is great. Having our UV islands use the exact same texture data is one of the best ways to optimize our textures. I got a few other tricks for optimizing, but I think that might wait for another video. Alright, so we got our legs done, now let's work on the tabletop. I think the easiest way to go about doing this is to mark the top and the bottom face off completely. Then what we'll do is we'll take each and every corner and then we'll mark it from the top all the way down to the inside like this. You know what? Let's actually add a wood texture to this. I think that would enhance really what we're doing so we can get a real feel of what's actually happening. I'm just gonna go down to this button that looks like two pieces of paper and click it. This is gonna make an entirely new material for us. I'm gonna rename it to wood, and then I'm just going to go over here to the texture, and I'm gonna load in a wood texture that I have saved for this. Now, the reason why I need a wood texture is because the flow of the wood grain is very important to the construction of the actual table itself. The grain should flow along the length of the surface of the mesh, not width-wise. Otherwise, it just sort of looks silly. And if you know a bit about woodworking, it would also make it more brittle. So we're going to orient our UV maps to be along the grain. But before we do that, we should optimize them first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take every similar UV island and I'm going to put them with each other. So that way they all share a similar UV space. I'm going to go about this in a more precise way, so here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to hit the big table face, I'm going to hit Shift S to bring up the selection menu, and I'm going to select cursor to selected. Then I'm going to select the smaller face and do the exact same thing again with the Shift S, but this time instead of clicking cursor to selected, we're going to do selected to cursor offset. We want to make sure that we're using the one with offset. If we use the normal selected to cursor, what happens is every single point of the face that we selected gets compacted into the 2D cursor. So that's not what we want at all. And then we're just going to do the exact same process with the sides here. We'll just move all of them into one singular point. Now, if all of our islands properly optimized, what we need to do is average them by size so that way they're proportionate to each other, and then we can start manually packing them, like we did with our box. Just gonna go about selecting them like this, pack them near the left corner, and scale them up to size. And with that, we have the table finished, and it looks good too. Now, the only objects that we got left are all the things that we had linked in, so we're gonna have to go to them individually and work on them in their own local space. We'll do the can because it's literally a can. I'm sure you know my sentiments on cutting cans at this point. Then we have the candy bar and the MRE. Really, they're both the exact same process for doing both of them, so I'm only gonna show one of them. We're gonna mark a seam along the side, we're gonna flap up the top and bottom, and then we're just gonna place seams to help alleviate the stretching. And that is the same process for both the MRE and the candy bar. And now, we're down to the last model, the big one. We gotta unwrap this bad boy, the breakfast machine. If you're new to UV mapping and you want a challenge, try unwrapping this model. I think I've shown enough techniques in this video that you are properly equipped to tackle this model. So if you want to accept this challenge, I have a link to the model in the description below. You can download it and you can open it up in Blender and you can try to unwrap it yourself. You can always check your work and come back later and see what I did. Not to say what I'm doing is right, you might come up with an answer that's better than mine. UV mapping is just one of those nebulous things that have multiple answers to it, unlike algebra. Anyway, if you want to take the challenge, you can stop the video here. I'm gonna keep going. So here's what I'm gonna do first. I'm gonna do the lid. I always work from the small details and then work inward. And all the lid is, if you think about it, is just a bowl with a knob on the top. I'm gonna mark a seam along the inside of the mesh. Then I'm gonna mark off the knob on the top. Then I'm going to mark a seam going up the knob, and then unlike how I normally cut the face off, I'm going to mark out this X pattern on the top, and it's going to unfold like this over here on the UV space. The knob is such a small detail of the actual model itself that when everything is averaged out and proportional again, it's barely even going to be noticeable. Now let's move on to the bulk of the pot. One thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to mark off all the tertiary stuff. All the things that jut out from the main portion of it. Those are just begging to get marked. We're going to mark off the handles, we're going to mark off this button console, and we're going to mark off this platform that's jutting out of the pot. The button console is easy enough, we just have to alleviate the stretching on the corners by marking them. I'm going to select all these corner seams by holding Ctrl Alt then clicking so I can mark all of them at once. Now to work on the handles. I'm only going to work on one and then copy my work onto the other one, so that way I don't have to work twice. Gonna do the tried and true Coke can method. Mark a seam down the side and flap it down. Now you think what I might do is take our handles and symmetrize them across the X-axis like I normally would. However, there's one problem with that. When we unhide our model, we can see that the faces around the handle that we symmetrized to got deleted. This is because when we symmetrize, what we're actually doing is replacing the vertices that are there. So all the faces that would be composed of the original vertices no longer exist because they got deleted when we symmetrized. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to select all of the seams on this handle and mirror them onto the other. So the way we're going to go about doing this is we're first going to have to select our seams. Now I'm not going to select them manually because that's meticulous and boring. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to select one seam and then I'm going to bring up the select by similar menu by hitting Shift G. Then we select seam from the menu and then all of our seams get highlighted. Now to mirror these seams onto the other handle, what we need to do is hold Ctrl Shift and hit M. This will mirror our current selection to the other side of our mesh depending on what axes we want to mirror it from. With our selection mirrored, all we have to do now is mark the seams and we'll be done with the handles. The platform can be marked the exact same way we just did the handles. Mark a seam down the center and then flap down the end. Though this time I'm going to place the seam on the bottom just so that way it's hidden from view. Alright, now we're down to the bulk of the actual pot itself. I'm going to mark off the inside of the pot and I'm going to mark off the bottom of the pot just to separate it from the rest of it. We're going to also separate the inside from the outside of the pot. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to mark a seam along the rim of this pot right here. And now I should be able to separate them from each other. So now I'm going to select the outside and hide everything else. I'm going to mark a side up the front, and then I'm going to alleviate some of the stretching over here by marking along these seams. Now for the inside, we're going to mark one seam down the front like this, and then we're going to start to alleviate the stretching. Now, unfortunately, when I started to alleviate the stretching, they started to overlap over themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a follow active quad along these faces right here, since they're actually very rectangular. And that seems to fix my problem. Alright, that's the bulk of everything done. Now we just gotta work on the nozzle and the handles over here. I'm gonna work on the handle first. Now this looks more complicated than it actually is. If we were to actually stretch it out and flatten it, all it is a long tube that's been wrapped in a U shape. We can still do the Coke can method here. Gotta mark a seam down the sides, gonna flop down the edges. And then for good measure, we're gonna do a follow active quad along this to straighten it all out. If you do a follow active quad, be sure to pin your islands so that way they don't get undone as we keep working. The live unwrap will break them again. Alright, moving down, we got the top part of the nozzle. This is where the water comes in and pours into like a little Keurig pot or whatever. Here's how I'm gonna go about doing it. I'm gonna mark a seam all along the bottom until we reach this point right here. Then we're gonna mark across from here, and then we're gonna flow up the side like this until we reach the top right here at this corner. Then I'm just gonna go into the UV editor and I'm gonna fix these up right here. And congratulations, we've made a Galaga ship. I'm gonna do a follow active quad to straighten it all up, and then I'm gonna pin it so that way it doesn't get destroyed as we keep moving. Alright, now onto the final stretch. We're down here to where you put the little flavor pods in the breakfast machine or whatever. First order of business is we need to get the pod holders out of here as well as the nozzle on the bottom. They're just vestigial extra stuff. I'm gonna flatten them out and then do a follow active quad on them. Then it's time to move on to the actual bulk of what's left. The island that's left is pretty flat, so I don't think I even need to work in the 3D viewport. I'm just gonna go into the UV editing mode full screen. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to break that ring up. So I'm just gonna mark these two edges right here, and that should open it right up. Alright, that did the trick. Now to just alleviate the stretching, I'm just gonna mark seams along it where I see there's a lot of stretching. And with that, we got the last island made. Now we just gotta select everything and put it all together. Go back into object mode, select the lid and the pot, then go into edit mode, average out all the islands, pack it all together, and there we have the final UV map done. Everything that we have modeled up to now, with exception with the character model, has been UV mapped. Speaking of the character model, since we're near the end of the video, I want to talk a bit about that. After the basic human modeling tutorial, I posted a survey in the description of that video so you guys could vote on what kind of character you're wanting me to design. Well, as of right now, there are only 30 votes submitted. I really wanted that character from the tutorial to be something of an amalgamation of what everyone wanted. Of course, I know I won't be able to please everyone with one model, but I do have plans on taking some of these suggestions and making them maybe their own video at some time later. If you're interested in voting, the link for the survey is in the description below. Go and let me know what you want to see this character to turn out to be. I also want to apologize for this video that A, it's so long, and B, it took so long to get out. On top of numerous technical issues which set me back, the original script that I was writing just wasn't coming out the way that I wanted it to. It didn't feel right. I struggled for a month to try and keep writing, and the best thing that I could have done for this video was to delete the original script and just start over. UV mapping as a subject is very nebulous and very hard to explain in one video, so if you guys have any questions or need help, please leave a comment below. I'll either respond directly or I'll address it in a follow-up video that'll hopefully clear up some problems. I hope this video was helpful and informative, and I hope it was worth the wait. If you're interested, want to contact me and address problems directly, or just want to hang out in a community, I have a personal Discord server you can come and hang out in. It's been a really fun experience running that, and I've been meeting some really awesome people. The link for that is also in the description. Be sure to check out the PS1 subreddit for other content, or to post something that you made yourself. And with that, I hope you liked the video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe as more will be coming. Next video should be about texturing, since we just got done with UV mapping. See you next time!